So I read up a little bit more about Heraclitus. Is that how you pronounce it? Heraclitus?
I don't know that anybody knows how to pronounce it. I in school, I always heard it as Heraclitus.
Heraclitus.
But
whatever.
Yeah, whatever. I don't fucking know.
So we're talking about the, some of his sayings. I found, by the way, of all places, a series of lectures on the introduction to Western philosophy on a website of the Ayn Rand Institute.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And,
I feel like that might be a particular selection, but fair enough.
Well, I mean, so
it's not a bad selection.
Yeah, but right now he's just talking about Heraclitus. He's, sure. And he goes through Socrates and all the others, and he's teaching to a class, and the lectures, by the way, were made in the 1970s. All right, he's teaching to a class. I forgot the guy's name. He's still alive. He's like 94 or something, and he was an associate of Ayn Rand. And this guy, again, I'm blanking on his name, and Ayn Rand made him the beneficiary of her will. So they were like really close together, and
close.
Probably. I mean, I don't know.
Knowing Ayn Rand, yeah.
Was she promiscuous?
I mean, I don't know. It's promiscuous, but she definitely slept with people other than her husband, from what I understand.
Right.
Not that. I mean, whatever.
Yeah. And then somebody started making, sort of slides to sync with his, his lectures.
Yeah.
So he didn't make those slides himself. They just sort of synced up, and they sync up really well. And it creates a different dimension to the lecture. Sure. They're very good, and so I found all of his lectures, and I just bookmarked them, and I'm probably going to start going through his lectures because they're very entertaining. He's teaching to a class. He makes jokes. They laugh.
Philosophy professors are actually quite. I don't know. There's something about it.
Entertaining?
They are. They really are. Like I find. I think that's one of the hardest things about graduating was like trying to just read philosophy without the benefit of an entertaining lecturer. Amplified the difficulty by several orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
But some of my philosophy professors were hilarious. I mean, like very dry humor sometimes, but.
I feel like that should be the way you teach philosophy. I mean, you should be snarky. There should be like some level of snarkiness, sarcasm.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes it more palatable. But I mean, because you are critiquing it, right? So you need to have an attitude. You don't need to have an accepting attitude. You need to have a very critical attitude of like, well, I don't know if that's true, right? And so that snarkiness is at least a very the other opportunity is to be a dick, which also is available, but
which is also entertaining.
Can also be entertaining.
I'd listen to that for a while, because I have found some lectures on YouTube that are just incredibly dry. Like, I mean, you just want to swallow a bullet when you listen to that stuff. You're like, oh my God, I can understand why some of these people try to kill themselves. So anyway, a very entertaining guy. I have to figure out what his name is.
I remember one of my philosophy professors was writing something on the board, and he's like, consider this usual metaphysics, consider the color blue, and he wrote, he was from Scotland originally, I think, if I remember right. So he wrote COLOUR, blue, right? And then he goes, oh, y'all won't understand that. This is how you write it here in the colonies. I mean, just in the middle of his lecture, just randomly throwing shit out there. Not for any good reason. Just
So this lecturer was explaining Heraclitus' philosophy, and I'd been reading the chapter in Bertrand Russell, and I also went through a bunch of other YouTube videos on Heraclitus, but he made the essence of that philosophy very accessible, right? And so his explanation was that around that time, a lot of the philosophers were thinking about what is the world stuff? What is stuff made of? Like, what is the unitary thing? Well, you reduce it down to. And so I think before him, someone said everything is water. Someone else says everything is earth. And so he said everything is fire. Right, Heraclitus did, and and I'd read that in.
I wasn't aware. Okay.
So and I read that.
Remember that.
But so he explains it really in a phenomenal way. But either way, I read that in that Introduction to Philosophy book I have over there, and the main tagline on top is everything is fire, and it goes through Heraclitus a little bit, and in the end I'm like, okay, so everything is fire. Why is this significant? Why am I reading about this 2,500 years later? I mean, if I'm reading about it that much later, it should be like the bomb. These should be real words of wisdom. I'm like, this doesn't seem that profound to me. Is this just a history lesson, or is there some profundity here? And so the explanation was really phenomenal, right? So they were looking for world stuff, right? The philosophers at that time. And we talked about this the other day on the hike. Heraclitus' view was that, you can't ever define a thing. Right. The moment you say that this is that chair you're sitting on, the chair has changed, because things are with time changing. And, it's odd that he believed this, even though he didn't know about, say, quantum physics. Right. Sure. So on a quantum level, nothing is constant at all. Right. You could look at a statue and say, well, all right, the statue is at least almost, it is the same 1 second to the other second. So let's just call the statue a statue and stop splitting hairs. But on a quantum level, the superposition of electrons, there's vibration of atoms. From that perspective, too, things are changing. He didn't know that, but he still said, look, nothing ever actually stays the same. Sure. And so before you are done saying the word, this is a thing, before you can say the thing has now changed, right? So the only constant that there is, if you were looking for what world stuff is change. That's the only thing that's constant, right? That's the only thing you can say is always there. And so that's where, it gets into the sort of statement of, you can't ever step in the same river twice. Sure. He's also said, nothing is, everything is becoming. Which is also something he said as well. And so the perfect metaphor for this in the natural world is fire, right? Because it's not really physical, right? It's always changing. There's no such thing as a static flame, right? The flame is constantly changing as well from moment to moment. And so his metaphor for this philosophy was that everything is made of fire. So it's not like literally, he didn't mean that in a literal sense at all. So I thought that was like a really great explanation, of like
the history of that idea.
Yeah. And then he suggests that Aristotle demolishes this idea completely or something. I haven't gotten that far, but interested to see what this guy has to say about Aristotle and the rest. Now I'm getting into it a little bit, slowly reading and, assimilating. It's exciting. I'm like, I wonder what Aristotle has to say about this.
Yeah. It was fascinating to me. And I think certainly I'd love to watch the lectures with you, but just reflecting back to you as a friend for, a long time now, it is interesting watching you go through the process of gaining a philosophical view, right? And what I mean by that is that, even this idea that you just expressed is something that I've at times struggled to try to convey, right? A thing is not a thing. But if I say that, you're just like, dude, you're just being obtuse, right? Now you're making ridiculous points, you're splitting hairs, you're just, and you've been dismissive at times of that kind of thing. But as you engage and you start to be like, well, wait a minute, on a quantum level, just what you said, right? On a quantum level, it isn't. So why is it that we think it is a thing? What does that say about the world? What does that say about the nature of nature, right? Or the nature of matter, or the nature of naming.
Right. Yeah. Naming, labeling.
Labeling. Right. And in particular, I actually, and I don't know if you want to get into it right now, but I actually think that naming is an extremely profound process. That is so intuitive to us that it seems trivial, but in fact underpins essentially all of humanity in some sense, right? And I think different authors and in religious traditions, in the both Bible and Quran actually.
By who?
Bible and Quran.
Oh, Bible and Quran.
Both indicate that one of the first things that happened was, God created Adam and taught him the names of things. Right. And so there is this insight, and then Ursula K. Le Guin in her Wizard of Earthsea series, I don't know if we've ever talked about this. So,
no.
So she wrote a series of books set in a fictional world of Earthsea, and there are wizards and whatever, but she's very clever. She's a brilliant writer in many ways, but in her system of magic, right, she actually says that what the wizards have to do, they have to have some innate talent for magic, but combined with that talent, they have to go learn the names of things in order to gain mastery by magic over them. And the name can't be the common name, it has to be the name that God called it when he created it, right? So there is some original name for that thing, right? And actually, and she gives this example is that, you can't just command the ocean because in fact, if you talk about, for instance, the Atlantic Ocean, well, but the Gulf of Mexico also has a name, right? And so, in fact, when you say Atlantic Ocean, what you mean is Atlantic Ocean except the Gulf of Mexico. And it's not even that. It's like all these other exceptions. So if you were to try to command all the water in the world, you would have to individually name each and every sort of body, which is an interesting framework of magic, right? But it also encapsulates something really fascinating, because where does the Gulf of Mexico end? Right. That's somewhat arbitrary, right? Like, when does that become the Atlantic and when does it not? Right. And so if you were in this fictional world and you were a wizard and you were going to command the Gulf of Mexico, right? Not that there's the Gulf of Mexico in the world, but, but this thing, then you say, okay, Gulf of Mexico, waters be still, or whatever, right? Which waters would be still? That's an interesting question, right? And it is that kind of thing. It gets into all these ideas of what is blue, what is red, like where are the edges of blue? When does it become green? Right. All of these things is the process of naming is picking out or labeling something in the context of continua. Right. Right. And so the odd thing is we get in such a habit of it that we think the thing is in the world, when it's not. It's actually just continua, and we happen to find it useful to sort of talk about that set of atoms, right? That bowl over there. That set of atoms is useful enough that we come up with the label bowl for things that are shaped that way, right? And therefore, I'm able to pick it out, and it's so intuitive to you that we don't question it, but it's actually quite odd. And so, yeah, I think that idea of naming, I'm just eager to see you also kind of go through that evolution of and that really is the sort of the beginnings of philosophy in some senses, is the process of questioning the obvious, right? The things that are so obvious you've never thought to question them, and then when you do, you're like, well, maybe that's not obvious at all. It seems obvious because we're all doing it without problem, right? And none of us struggle with, why is that a bowl? None of it, like, if I say bowl, you're not like, what?
Yeah, right.
And yet it is not obvious when you really dive into it as to exactly how that naming process works, right?
It's interesting that, that metaphor for, the world stuff is made of fire, or the world is made of fire. In present day, you could say everything is energy, and if E is equal to mc squared, then that's actually true in a very physical sense. Everything is energy, right? In fact, when energy cools a little bit, then you have a proton, or you have quarks or whatever coalesce, and that turns into bigger things, and so some of these ancient Greek scholars, like Pythagoras, said everything is numbers. And you talk to anyone who's watched The Matrix, and like, yes, that's exactly right. It's everything is an algorithm. Maybe you're just part of like a virtual reality, Sure. So I want to talk about Pythagoras for a little bit as well. But one of the things that I noted in all of this discussion about, is a thing, is that there was no treatment of time, right? So in a point of time, yes, if in that point of time it's not, evolving into something else, if it's not eroding, the water's not flowing, whatever, then it is that thing, So there's no treatment of time. I mean, time was thought to be such an innate thing that if you're going to be talking about where things end or begin, or rather the labeling of things, or if a thing is a thing, the idea that it really isn't a thing is only true because the arrow of time constantly causes a change, right? But there was never a consideration about what is time, Is that something that should be given the philosophical treatment or not?
I mean, later authors certainly have considered time as a factor. I don't remember Heraclitus well enough. I mean, with Pythagoras and Heraclitus, it's not where I spent most of my time. I took, one history of philosophy course, but, and so, I mean, certainly I wouldn't say I'm qualified to discuss that in the context of Heraclitus, right? But if we're talking about well, two factors there is, how do we consider the philosophy of time? That's an interesting separate question. And then this idea is, you said the thing is the thing if you leave time out of the equation. And I would actually say that's not true, right? Because, and this is kind of gets back to my earlier point, is like, okay, if you consider a statue, where does the statue end and the air around it begin? Right? And you can say, well, the statue is made of certain molecules or certain types of atoms, right? Though if you get far enough down, it's all the same quarks, right? And electrons, so that's also a little bit murky, right? It's all probability clouds that are intersecting with each other, so that even gets murkier. Maybe, and you could say, well, maybe it's the density of collection of the probability clouds, right? But if you put a statue on a marble stand made of the same thing, right? Well, the density is the same, right? And so now how do you differentiate the one from the other, right? And even this bowl and the table, I mean, on an electrical level, they're being held apart by the repulsion of the electrons between them. But that means the electrons are incredibly close together, and perhaps equally close, depending on the setup, as the electrons within the substance itself, right? You could take other examples, right? We've named the solar system, right? But on what basis, right? Like, that is a thing because we have named it so. And yet, does it include planet X or not? Does it include Pluto or not? Does it, and what are the edges of the solar system? And, it's mostly space, just like an atom is, right? So we name an atom as a thing, but it's mostly empty, right?
Yeah. So
even without time, you end up with these odd questions about how are we telling where the statue ends, right? How is that a thing, right? And I've made the argument, and this is why I think naming is profound, is that we name the statue a thing because it is useful to us in some way to pick out that set of atoms. It doesn't actually exist in the universe. It's just an undifferentiated mass of matter at differing densities. And there are no things, right? It's a continuum. But out of that continuum, purely for our own usefulness, we start picking these things out. Or so even without time,
labeling is artificial abstraction.
Yep.
Right, and that's just useful. So I mean, Heraclitus never, I don't think he got into the boundary of things, right?
Correct.
He just sort of said, it's not a thing because, time just moves forward and it doesn't really think about it very much.
Yeah, his was mostly change-based.
Yeah,
right. He was saying that, as far as I understand, that the thing is not constant because it is constantly changing, which is over time, right? Whereas this is a different abstraction. Is the thing may not be the thing because it's a massive. Why is the statue not considered in terms of its sole orbit around the sun in some sense?
Yeah, or rather, the thing that you just labeled has been snatched by the arrow of time into the next instant. So. In a sense, that thing you've just labeled has disappeared.
Well, that would be Heraclitus's.
Right.
Yeah.
Heraclitus.
Yeah, I was talking about. So the other view is a different one, right?
So Pythagoras was also really interesting to read about. Apparently, also another jerk, just like Heraclitus. Apparently, half of these people were like assholes. In Greek
philosophy does have that effect. Case in point. Yeah.
So at least what I've read of him, one of his most profound sort of contributions to philosophy was to recognize that the study of, or the acquiring of knowledge is a exercise in contemplation, in almost like a spiritual sense, right? And so they were contemplatives, the Pythagorean cult. It was basically a cult, right? So what I learned over there was they had this analogy of the three kinds of people who come to the Olympic Games, right? They say that there's the worst kind, the base kind, are the hawkers and sellers, right? The people who are selling you peanuts in the gallery or whatever, right? They're like the worst kind. And then slightly above that are the people who are competing, and then they have, they're a little bit better. They have some honor, and they're competing, and they're discipline involved, and so they're a little bit better. But their view of it was that the best kind of person are the people in the stands who are just looking at the entire spectacle in a somewhat disinterested way. And they felt like this was a good analogy to run your life with, right? So you weren't involved in the base efforts of doing anything useful in life, like commerce or improving yourself, in a sense of like an athletic way. But you were just, observing in a dispassionate way. And so they applied that ethic to the contemplation of, mathematics, right? Which they, for the first time, really, discovered that there were some universal truths. 2 + 2 is always equal to 2. 2 + 2 is always equal to 4, right? And there's no two ways about that, right? And then they all, of course, discovered the harmonic sequence and the Pythagoras' law as well, and that sort of thing. And I was thinking about how profound it was in that kind of time when the world at that time was thought to be just ruled by gods and their moods. It rained or it thundered. Or there was an earthquake because some god got pissed off, and that's why that happened. And these people ended up discovering something that was just super natural, right? It was outside of the natural order of things. It was not about earthquakes or that 2 + 2 is going to be equal to 4, no matter what the gods thought about it, right? And so they found an area of knowledge, an area of contemplative revelation that must have been really profound at that time. Like, oh shit, this thing is, absolute, and it doesn't matter what the gods think about it; it's still going to be true. So that was almost it's almost the discovery of pure mathematics, or the pursuit of pure mathematics. Assumed an aura of religious experience. It's like you are uncovering these, laws of nature, and it seems like, hey, this nature actually has some rules to it, and then it's almost like you hack the some sort of like the Matrix, like oh crap, this thing is all code, and that's a profound revelation, right? This is everything is code here. And so I think that's why, at least from what I've read, the Pythagorean movement was kind of like a religious cult, and
again, rightfully so on some level. This actually gets back a conversation we had before when we were walking, first of all, but second of all, and I'll pull that in as well, but exactly what we've been talking about, the idea of naming, right? And this is, again, a layer of abstraction, right? Giving something a name. And what we were talked about is, there are these sort of remote villages that were untouched by modernity, and if you ask them to sort cloth into their different colors, they couldn't do it because each color was considered individual.
Right.
And so they couldn't say, well, this is a shade of red. This is its own color and has to be put in its own basket because, right? And similarly, they were like that for everyday objects. Is like they're the idea of sorting in or abstracting was not there. Each object is in itself, right? There isn't. So the other example I gave is said, hey, all the bears in the north are white. So if you went up to the north and you saw a bear, what color would it be? They were unwilling to say. They said, I haven't been there. How could I possibly say what color that bear is until I have seen it? It's a very concrete way of approaching the world, right? And so that was just 1940. Like that's not thousands of years ago, right? The modern level of abstraction is actually extremely new, and along with that is this idea of abstracting. Again, I think this is a profound. It's so common to us that it's hard to realize, but the idea of abstracting to the number 2 is actually incredibly non-obvious.
What do you mean? I don't understand.
Because why is it that there's not just one of everything? Because in some sense, each object is unique. So it's actually a perfectly reasonable way to look at the world that there's only the number 1, right? And if something doesn't exist, then it doesn't exist. So there's no zero.
Right.
It's just one. Like,
I see.
so any number other than one is actually somewhat non-obvious, right? Because the idea of two is the idea of grouping.
Right.
There's enough similarity between these things. I'm going to now, create a superordinate category in my mind to which both of these things belong. And then I'm going to start operating with that category as if it's a thing in itself, right? So rather than just the left bowl and the right bowl, now I have the concept of bowls, and I'm going to start making statements about the nature of bowls and what a bowl is and what it's not.
So do you think animals are, they have to be capable of this kind of abstraction as well? I mean, they have to be. They may not have. About it. I don't know. I mean, so like, take, for example, a chimpanzee, right? A primate. They're going to, recognize a banana, right? So if they see one banana, and then, a week later they see another banana, they group that in their mind like, oh, this is that thing that if I eat, I'll do well with. So animals must be able to do this. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you can also, so
that raises an interesting question is if you don't have a language for that abstraction, is it equally profound?
No, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
So, if animals then can abstract, in groups in that way without language, presumably chimpanzees don't have, inner dialogue. Or, not even a chimpanzee, an eagle or,
there are these weird reports, right? Horrific circumstances. There was one in ancient Egypt that I know of, and there was one more recently, like 1970s, I want to say, where like horrific abuse of children. Like literally, there was a child. That 1997 was a pretty horrific story. This girl was basically kept chained in a cupboard from the time she was born, basically, right until whatever age, 8 or 13 or whatever she was, and was fed but not interacted with at all, and had no language, right, and really was not able to ever master grammar. She did come to master, and she, I don't know the details of the case as to what she had words or whatever, but she never did master language the way we do, and it's kind of the way we take for granted. Yeah. And it's an interesting idea that, there is a window for children of acquiring these abstractions, the abstraction of sound naming, right? And it's difficult to put yourself in the mind of someone who maybe has the ability to differentiate objects and use tools or recognize a banana, and yet has no name for it. Right, and has not made the abstraction to the idea of language or communication, right? It's really difficult to put your mind there. I've struggled with I've always imagined trying to put my head into, Helen Keller actually also talks about this a little bit before she met her teacher, Sullivan. She had a very animalistic way of being in the world, deaf, dumb, and blind. She interacted with the world purely animalistically, if you read the reports from what she was like. And one of the biggest moments of change, and she reports this because she had memory of the moment she understood language, right? Which is a really weird thing to think about, right? Sure, yeah. But when the water was the word that got it, she put water flowing on her hand and then signed water into the other hand. And she'd been doing that for a long time, but she was just incredibly patient, and it finally broke through that this symbolized water in some, like that abstraction happened, and she had memory of it happening. And she literally started running around touching stuff and saying, what is it? What's the symbol? Right. Because all of a sudden there's a new world. Yeah. Like I find it very emotional actually to think about. Like you have to think about it from that child's perspective. Like, holy shit! Now I can communicate. Now, wait a minute. There's this whole symbology of representation that allows me now to if I remember right, she called it the moment she became human in some sense.
Wow.
Right. Because that's actually more than any other. That's our survival mechanism.
Yeah.
Is language.
Language. Yeah.
Right. Because now I don't have to go try to figure out.
Mechanism. That's literally the thing that distinguishes us from pretty much any other animal. Right. Language. I mean, no other animal has that.
That we know of. Yeah. I mean, and it's always questionable, right? And Orson Scott Card talks about this in his book. So he, Speaker for the Dead, he talks. It's a sci-fi book, so it talks about aliens and this and that. But humanity is spread through the galaxy to other planets, and one of his characters proposes what he calls orders of foreignness, right? And so let me see if I can not butcher this. There is the Utlaning, the stranger you recognize as human but of another country. The Fromling, which is a stranger you recognize as human but of another planet. And then there's the Ramen, which not the noodle, but Ramen is the stranger you recognize as human but of another species. And then there is the Varels, which is the stranger you cannot recognize as human because you cannot communicate. And the statement he makes briefly there is that if you can't communicate, you can never be completely sure the other guy's not trying to kill you. Right? And so there's this weird issue that comes up with failure of language, right? And especially if you're talking about another species or whatever, maybe they communicate through some other mechanism and we don't. Maybe they have a language, but it's electromagnetic, or it's not auditory, or maybe they have a language, but it's gestural, right? Who knows? There's these weird possibilities of, or slow. What if it's auditory, but it's subsonic and words are spoken over the course of hours, right? Well, there's all these possibilities that language could be going on, and yet whatever that animal is has to be treated as an animal and not as a fellow human, because we cannot communicate. And so we were forever locked into some sort of like battle because cooperativity requires language, right? If we're going to share resources and we're going to come to some agreement about how we're going to do that, right?
So, taking this a little bit further, plants do communicate with other plants under the soil, right? So you saw that fantastic fungi documentary.
Yeah,
as well.
Okay. So we're talking about language communication.
Right. So I was going to say, let's just
sure.
stick with the word communication for now.
Sure.
So say plants communicate with other plants through whatever sort of chemicals they release through their roots. So that's one level of communication. And then of course you have humans that communicate with actual language. And then the argument is communication a spectrum, and at what level, coming back to the original conversation, what level do we call it language, right? Because gorillas have been trained to use sign language, right? So there's some capacity for language there, right?
Yep.
And dolphins too make noises, and they presumably understand each other just fine. They can coordinate, in hunting packs. So there's definitely some intelligible language there. But then what about ants? Right. And at what level? I guess maybe this, let's call it communication. It's not really language; it's communication. At what level do you decide
that language.
Okay, this is now, this is up to our level, right? And that raises another question. Say that we encountered.
Sorry, just to respond. It's kind of interesting. Is that the point he makes in the book? One of the most moving points in the entire book is he says, when we declare an alien to be Ramen and not Varels, it doesn't mean that they've reached a threshold of moral maturity. It means we have. Which puts a very interesting spin on this. The book is for instance, a long diatribe against the Star Trek's Prime Directive, actually. The entire book ultimately comes to the idea that the Prime Directive is fundamentally a power play designed to ensure the ongoing superiority of the human race. Which is not how Star Trek portrays it.
Right,
but he actually argues that that's fundamentally the subconscious motivation behind the Prime Directive.
But I don't understand why that's true. I mean, if a civilization under the Prime Directive evolved, just fine, and then develop the capacity to communicate with humans, and then communications and commerce or whatever could start. How does that benefit humanity exactly? I don't get the criticism.
Well, so the criticism is basically that in some real way, if you recognize the fundamental humanity of another person, right? And this is true actually, even with the beggar on the street on some level, right? I've read interesting reports where the thing that if like people that have talked to them, the thing that bothers them most is that no one meets their eyes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because and it makes sense because we think they're going to ask us for something.
Yeah.
So we avoid eye contact to kill the conversation.
Right.
But then they go through their entire lives and nobody will meet their eyes.
Yeah, no one will see them, right?
No one will see them. They are unseen, right? And they actually describe that as being some of the worst part of the experience, right? Yeah. Because you're cut off from humanity in this weird way, right?
Yeah, right.
And so there is this sort of dehumanization that happens there. Because we don't want to meet their eye and then say, no, I can't help you, or I won't help you, or I won't give you money, or whatever. But at least it's a human interaction that you engage with. And so, there's a similar thing here where like at our level, I think of it the same way realistically, right? I'm just not sure that's the right way to think about it in terms of language. Like it could be different. It could be just a very different.
No, but get back to how the Prime Directive is immoral. Or wrong.
Sorry. So the Prime Directive, he argues, I think, is immoral on the basis that it if you truly recognize the humanity of the other species, you would treat them the way you would treat your brother. You would treat them the way you would treat, another human being. If you had an infinite plethora of resources, you don't just say, yeah, you guys suffer through it for a couple centuries until you figure it out on your own and master sort of, star travel.
So they were only their humanness was only recognized if they developed technology advanced enough to make contact, and before that, the plague could get them, and that's all.
And they just die of starvation. They go through the whole thing. Like, how is that a compassionate response? How is it an acceptable response? Right. If they are fundamentally human.
That's why Picard broke the Prime Directive all the time.
Yeah.
And he always regretted it, but he did it all the time anyway.
Because any character that would be sufficiently compassionate enough for us to recognize him as heroic could never follow the Prime Directive truly to its conclusion.
I feel like there's a whole Star Trek series based on like someone overturning the Prime Directive on philosophical grounds. Like the entire series could just be like people talking in a room.
It's just interesting that the Speaker for the Dead, that is one of the contingent themes, is they have this attitude of it being for the aliens' benefit, that we want your culture to survive and all this stuff. Yeah. And they say, we see you coming up and down in spaceships, and we don't say, oh yeah, we want to protect our culture. We say, yeah, give me that.
Right.
We want to travel among the stars as well, right? And you've cut us off from it, right? And so, we are dying here, like, while you are trying to have some pseudo-noble idea of protecting our culture, right?
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I never thought about it. Even I always thought of that whole Prime Directive idea as being somewhat noble, because I guess Picard kept saying it was. I guess okay, if he thinks it's noble, it must be. Yeah. But it does make sense that it doesn't really hold muster, right? Because you're allowing all this suffering to occur.
And the idea is, there's trickiness to it, which is probably, and that's kind of the thing, right? Is that you don't give a pistol to a 4-year-old, right? But
you could give medicine, right?
Right.
This is how you would cure malaria. Here you go.
Sure.
Take this one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, the first Star Trek came out in the 60s, right? It was 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right, and so that was probably around the time, it was after World War II, the British Empire had completely collapsed. So, Gene Roddenberry probably had this whole colonial thing in his mind, right? He was growing up with this empire, then the empire collapsed, and of course India, Pakistan, and all of these different countries are supposedly colonized by by the white man, and it was a white man's burden and all that stuff. So I wonder if the Prime Directive was a direct reaction to the colonial past. Is like, yes, we're rich and powerful, but we're not going to tell you how to live yourself.
We're going to keep our hands off.
Right. It's like, when you're ready to come talk to us, we'll agree to you as equals, right? That was probably the impetus behind it.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that, but very possibly. It may have been a reaction to colonialism of just like, okay, well, maybe raping and pillaging is not the answer. But maybe hands off isn't really the answer either, right? Maybe there's a more compassionate way to meet people.
It's either rape or pillage, or
go fuck yourself.
Can't you talk to us and be nice?
No, slow down. We're British. We don't do that sort of thing.
And we do that, coming back to the humanness of things, right? I mean, we do that to animals, right? I mean, so chickens can't, talk to us about their inner lives, and we're happy to slaughter them, on an industrial scale.
But it's interesting, right? Because you look at the emotional reactions people have to the idea of like Chinese eating dogs, and that being a food, right? Because for us, we've humanized that species to on a cultural level, even, right? Or in the country where animals are in a lot of ways less humanized.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas we in the cities tend to.
Well, it might be that dogs and cats and those sort of things are. We are, because we keep them as pets, we are very aware that they have rich, complex emotional lives, right? Oh, this pet is now scared of the stranger, or the pet misses me when I'm gone, happy when I come back. So we know that there's a rich emotional life, and they can be somewhat expressive as well, barking or meowing in a certain way. Owners pick up on why they're doing that. And so once you're aware that there's a subjective, rich emotional life full of emotion, it suddenly becomes really taboo to eat that animal. Right.
Yep.
Although that's probably true of chickens as well. From what I've heard,
chickens are assholes.
Chickens are also. I mean, no one, for example, would think of eating a dolphin, right? Because people are, lots of people think that dolphins are very intelligent creatures, right?
One of my best friends in med school, John Abraham, he just had a fantastic sense of humor, but it was also very like in your face, like the joke was a little bit on you, right? So like he would go up to people like, and med, you know how med school people are, right? Like they're all kind of a little bit too straight laced for their own good, and right. And like no real sense of humor in the bunch anyway. And then a lot of them are very goody and like whatever, right? So he would wander up to people like just be like, if you had cancer, what would your make-a-wish be? Like, what would your wish be? And they'd say whatever. Oh, to plant a tree or some bullshit. Right. Some bullshit med student answer. Right? And he'd be like, I think I'd like to have a dolphin steak. Just so horrific. It was I really like to punch a dolphin. And then it was a panda steak was the other answer.
Steak,
panda steak and dolphin punching.
Or I want puppy meatballs.
just
We're gonna deny me my dying wish.
That's right. Just because this other person's giving like this complete softball answer, right? I like to punch a dolphin. Anyway,
No, so if we were to encounter advanced alien life, right? I mean, the distinction of what is human and not human. I'm talking about human here in a general sense, right? Sure. Of what is worthy of our time and effort and to engage with culturally, right? Yeah, ramen. Say. Yeah. If that is just based on, if we think of language as a spectrum, right? If we say, well, trees communicate and, chimpanzees communicate, we communicate the best. And so therefore we are most human, right? So if that kind of a spectrum is also adopted by aliens, there's a very real chance. I mean, this trope of aliens not, seeing humans as worthy of anything at all is an old one. But, those aliens are usually just, malfeasant. They're just, They just want our resources, which is the dumbest idea. Like, aliens came all the way over there, and the only planet they could find resources on was this one. Right. They had to like destroy all civilization to get the iron ore or whatever rare earth metal. Oh, they're here for the uranium. So I mean, that kind of paradigm could play out as well as like, well, this world is our I mean, who knows if they would even define life in any kind of meaningful way, right? I mean, like, would they distinguish between rocks and, a colony of ants versus humans, So that's sort of like something to think about it, because we do the same thing with chickens or ants or mosquitoes or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott Card's point to some degree, as I understand it anyway, I shouldn't speak for him, but as I understand his point, was a little bit that we think of it usually in terms of superiority and inferiority. But in fact, a better way to think about it is just compatibility. Are we able to talk enough to reach cooperativity? Right? And that's a weird metric, right? And actually, so the other hinging point of the story actually was that these aliens who were primitive and saw the humans in spaceships and all this stuff, and they were kind of in this hunter-gatherer type stage, right? They actually had access to a technology that we didn't have, but to them, they described it in religious terms, and they described it somewhat trivially because it was just a part of their life cycle, right? And so part of the story is that nobody realizes that they actually have something to offer that humanity doesn't have, right? Because they are considered inferior, right? And so the main character actually says is like, there's no chance you would notice that they had something to teach you, right? Because you've already set up the dynamic that way.
Right.
And so, I mean, you might think about that in terms of animals or in terms of like whatever you want, however you want to try and push that analogy, right? It really is just a matter of like, and pets is a great example, right? Pets are sort of right on that edge where it's like, if you make a little bit of effort to read body language differently and read barking and read this and that, you can sort of get to a cooperative place, right? And if you can get to a cooperative place, then all of a sudden they're human they're a different human, but there's a much greater degree of humanization there because you've learned to figure out their language, even if it's just body language, right? That communication now has reached a point where cooperativity is now achieved, whether it's they're protecting you or they feel affection for you, or they are, providing emotional support when you're sad, or you are responding to them and they're responding to you, and you've reached some level of cooperativity where you're not just competing for resources.
That is an interesting metric, right? Say, for example, we started exploring an alien planet. We land and it's full of puppies, right? And the puppies, to some extent can, it's just a nonsense example, right? But the, puppies can show affection and, excited when we land, and they don't have anything to offer us except that love, and then we would feel profoundly moved to protect the civilization, first directive be damned. That's right.
There's a Star Trek episode.
That's right. Picard risks, being expelled from the Starfleet because he found a planet full of puppies. It's like, God damn it, they need to be loved. We need to beam some on board. That would be an interesting episode.
Yep. No, it's interesting. I mean, Speaker for the Dead is one of the all-time great books of sci-fi, but they send out researchers to study this native species. And unbeknownst to the rest of Starfleet, they start teaching them agriculture and they start teaching them whatever, because they're starving and they just can't help but do it, right? But they keep it secret because they've been instructed by Prime Directive not to, right?
Is this a Star Trek or Speaker of the Dead?
Speaker for the Dead.
They have there's a Prime Directive thing there too.
Yeah, similar.
Oh, I see.
Similar
okay,
thing.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Dune is right up there in one of the best science fiction movies. Books.
Okay, Dune is Dune totally is.
Yeah.
I mean, I love Dune. Dune's probably my all-time favorite.
Yeah.
But this is up there pretty. And the weird thing about Speaker for the Dead, like Ender's Game kind of has a hard-hitting kind of feel to it, and it hits me hard because it describes my emotional experience of growing up. So I feel a very deep sort of response to Ender's Game in a lot of ways. But Speaker for the Dead is this like it grows in your mind like a cancer, and it just like takes over your perception of all these things that we sort of take for granted, like the Prime Directive or like religion and like all these things like, that are like, I don't know, just even like ideas like compassion, right? And so like in one of my favorite scenes, the young girl comes to the main character, Ender. Ender's still the main character in Speaker for the Dead, comes to Ender and says, this happened and there was this situation and I my brother was so upset and I heard him crying so much in the bathroom that he threw up, and I didn't go to him or, try to comfort him. I was too afraid of what my mom might say or whatever. And I think I should have probably done that. And Ender goes, yeah, you should have. Right? And like, there's no like, oh, well, I understand. Or it's like, yeah, you should have. Right? But she says that the magic of that moment, the author describes the magic of that moment is that by speaking the truth, she had the opportunity to realize that now in having that insight, she was someone different than she had been before. And that she wouldn't make that decision again. Right? And that now maybe she was a new person in some sense than the person who allowed that to happen. So I don't know. It just kind of put the idea of compassion even a little bit on its head, right? So I don't know. All these ideas I think grow in your mind. I think that's what makes it a really profound work. Dune does the same thing.
Are you excited for the new Dune movie or series? Is it a series or a movie?
Movie.
It's a movie?
Yeah.
I don't know why they even bother trying. It's just like a waste of time.
I think it's one of those things where like everybody keeps like hoping that this can be done, even though all the evidence indicates that it just can't be done.
As a movie. It needs to be like a 10-hour miniseries.
So they did make a 10-hour miniseries, by the way.
Oh, they did?
Have you ever seen it?
No. Is it any good?
It's better than the others.
Yeah.
I think the thing that bugs me the most about any of the like similar Ender's Game or like the source material is brilliant at like 8 different levels, right? And some idiot director's like, oh, but I can make it better. And then they change shit that just like it no longer works. Right. The point of what it, I think I read somewhere that in this Dune they've decided to make Liet Kynes a woman.
Okay. Whatever. I mean, I know that was necessary, but
it's not necessary, first of all, but it also destroys some of the intrigue, right? In that, like, he and Jessica had certain chemistry, like potential chemistry, mating chemistry type thing, right? Or he, and he had a wife and had children and had, so there are other issues is that, well, he's dead. Now what happens to that?
Yeah.
And, like just making him a woman for no fucking reason because actually warps the story.
Correct for whatever reason. It's a politically correct thing to do.
And I mean, like it just warps the entire weft of the story that.
The mystical aspects of Dune is what made it incredibly powerful. Right?
And Star Wars, which is, by the way, that's my ongoing issue, is that the reason all the other Star Wars suck is they got rid of that. They wanted to make it scientific,
right.
Quote unquote. And it completely lost all interest.
Yeah. I mean, George Lucas was probably influenced by Tolkien, there was a lot of like spirituality, mysticism, there.
Well, and in the 60s, I mean, the whole like LSD, I mean, I'm sure he had some psychedelic experiences and,
he was a student of Joseph Campbell as well. And so he modeled, I mean, Star Wars is all.
Dude, even Winnie the Pooh has a psychedelic scene. Like,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. With the heffalumps. Like, it's a scary, like, trip. It's a bad trip. Like, so does
so
Dumbo.
what's going on with our modern pop culture where we can't tolerate like mystical themes in the last one, I wouldn't say like The Matrix came close to any kind of mystical
Yeah, it did.
in a very technological, it was a very sterile mysticism, right? In that, oh yes, there's actually the one, and then I'm only talking about the first movie, right? The one that came out in '99. So that was a very sterile. He ascends, the Matrix, and the Matrix is actually an actual computer program. So if there was, it was very sterile. But I can't like think of.
No, but again, even there, the thing that made it work is this unspoken idea of
self-belief, maybe, or
and
faith.
Discontent with the world and faith, right? And the whole prophecy and like there is no spoon and like those kinds of things, like
except the sequels shat on that whole idea, right? I mean, in the sequels, it turned out that no, the one is also just some other measure of control, and all of the mythology is just to control Zion, so we can come and destroy it again.
Yeah.
So they basically shit all over.
Dude. Then the third movie totally makes it mystical, right? Because in the real world, he sees it like the Matrix. Right?
I never really understood like that.
So even though he's blind, he can see. Right? Because he's blind, he's got the blindfold on. But he's actually still able to see. He's lost his eyes. But he actually, from what he learned in the Matrix, now in the real world is operating on the same principles. And even at the end of the second movie, like he produces his own sort of EMF pump. Right? In the real world, he's starting to operate as if the real world is the Matrix. Right, so that's very much and actually the whole battle between him and Smith, he's why do you keep getting up? Is because I choose to. Right, it's a fundamental statement of the idea of will, right? Which we can get into in probably annoying detail and probably will at some point, but so I mean, like I think that mysticism is a lot of what made the movie captivating. Actually,
they're making a part 4 now, right?
Yeah.
I
mean, I don't know. I actually enjoyed all 3. I know a lot of people tapped out at 2 or 3 because they got kind of talky and a little bit maybe esoteric. But for a philosophy-minded person, when you have the background in philosophy and the Merovingian is expressing existentialism, and then fundamentally the Matrix is kind of a Buddhist view, but free will, Neo is actually espousing like free will, so that kind of even takes him to a different level beyond purely the Buddhist kind of concept of nirvana or whatever. He's like, no, actually, even beyond that is the ability to choose your own destiny in some sense. So I don't know. I mean, the movie actually makes some interesting philosophical points, but they get a little bit.
Maybe I'll start watching it once I get through the whole history of Western philosophy.
It's an interesting, it's an interesting watch.
They don't have any Heraclitus in there, I don't think.
No, probably. Right? I probably don't think they go that far back. No, I mean, it's interesting. There's some great movies that have aspects of mysticism, not just Star Wars and whatever, but What Dreams May Come was a brilliant movie as well.
The Robin Williams
Robin Williams, yeah. And so, but yeah, I think, I don't know why. I think it's become unpopular. I think in a lot of ways, and this is something you and I have talked about at different times, something that I find troubling at the least, but also probably wrong, is I think we have kind of allowed scientific consensus and or technology to ascend to our religion.
Right.
And we operate that way as if these are the truths, capital T. Even if they're theory, I think I sent you an article recently. Did I send you that?
Yeah, I think so.
There's a consortium of physicists actually that have kind of said like, hey, the Big Bang actually doesn't really...
Did you send me that?
I
just read that yesterday though, but I don't know if you sent it to me. Okay.
But debating whether the Big Bang actually
occurred, exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be said for science, obviously, right? Like, and the fact that the scientific method is self-correcting means that over time you start to converge on the truth. But that's fantastic, right? But we tend to act and speak as though science has already done that in every possible domain, right? And that overconfidence about the present state of science,
Right.
I think has led us to treat mysticism with a certain disdain.
Yeah. Or at least the question should be asked, right? Can science, answer all questions?
Sure.
Well,
and I mean, even science says it can't, right? So, one of my favorite proofs. What's the guy's name? Gödel. Kurt Gödel was a mathematician who basically was able to prove mathematically that any numeric systems. We're talking about base mathematics. We're not talking about anything fancy. Numbers, right? Any base system of numbers, including arithmetic and that kind of thing, is either self-contradictory or incomplete, right? And by incomplete, it means that there are things that are true about the system that cannot be proven within the system, right? And that's just math. That's not science, that's not physics, that's not anything. That's baked into the fundamental, like we were talking about Pythagoras and how the fundamental code of the universe is math. Baked into that fundamental code is the fact that there are some truths that are unprovable. That's fucked up. Like, that's a kind of weird, and not how we think about math usually, right? Or science, right? But it is actually proven, like not even discussed, but actually mathematically proven that the set of things that are true is larger than the set of things that are provable.
Right.
So we know that there's that bit, but we act as if we don't because our religion tells us that science will answer all our questions. And we approach it that way, that science is our religion in the modern West in some sense. And our religion tells us that science has all the answers, and so all this mysticism bullshit has to fall by the wayside. Right?
Maybe we just don't have the right language.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly the mystics always struggle with language, right? I mean, that's why probably some of the big mystic writers are usually poets, they don't write philosophical treatises. One of my favorite, Gibran obviously is a very spiritual writer, right? He says, when life cannot find a poet to sing her heart, she produces a philosopher to speak her mind. It is, philosophy is very much sort of the secondary, like, okay, like, his other one, no, that wasn't him, it was someone else, but it was saying that paradox is truth standing on her head to gain attention. And like, spiritualists and philosophers or mystics and spiritualists often speak in paradox and in poetry because those things convey this sense of, yeah, that's true. Why? Nah, I don't know, but it is, right? And I can't even say what you just said. Like, I can't even really hammer into exactly what you just said poetically, right? But number one, I understood it in some way. And number two, I think what I understood is true. And yet it's beyond my capacity really people write books on poems, like that in itself is a weird thing, right? Somebody writes a poem and then centuries later, somebody else, some grad student, right, goes back and writes a book about that poem.